Welcome to Samizdat Broadcasts, your voice of dissent on the internet. In a December 31st, 2015 post, Salon boasts proudly that 2015 was the year of the social justice warrior, and progressives should embrace the term. Although the term social justice warrior was constructed as an insult against progressive activists, the year 2015 has amply demonstrated why liberals should embrace the term. Social justice issues dominated the year, from race to sexual identity and beyond. Wrong again, Salon. This reads like many progressive defenses of political correctness as simply being nice or being respectful to one another. I would not argue against being a decent, conscientious person. There's nothing to be gained by using racial slurs or being rude and boorish towards overweight women, or anyone come to that. In fact, I would go farther than Salon and a lot of other socially progressive blogs these days and dare to suggest that our decency and conscientiousness should be for all, except those whose actions warrant censure, including the dreaded cishet white male, instead of being parceled out according to who has more marginalized identities. Let's be honest here, if you're demanding respect for your own little in-group while boasting unironically of drinking white male tears or #KillAllWhiteMales, then you're a two-faced hypocrite with the moral compass of a toddler, plain and simple. Conflating political correctness with niceness and being socially liberal with being a social justice warrior is a wide path that ends in authoritarian regressive leftism. It's not nice to criticize the barbarism of Islamism. They are the victims of Western colonialism after all, so we'd better not do it. It's not nice to point out the very real social dysfunctions in black and other minority communities. They're the victims of institutional racism after all, so we'd better not do it. It's not nice to criticize misandry and feminism or advocate for male victims of sexual and domestic violence. Women are the victims of patriarchy and rape culture, after all, so we'd better not do it. Know what? There's nothing nice about any of this. The victims in all of the above cases are very real. Refusing to talk about it for fear of offending established interests is as far away from being nice and being what liberalism is supposed to be about as you can get. This in mind, going forward, I'm not going to use the term social justice warrior or its abbreviation SJW in describing them. Instead, I'm going with regressive leftism. It sounds a lot better to criticize regressive leftists than it does to criticize social justice warriors. Language, and the mental frames that word choice evokes, matters. Regressive leftists themselves are patently aware of this when they tar their opponents with privilege. And, as one example, criticize rape culture instead of due process. To get a better sense of what the regressive left is really all about, this excellent article on extremism is a useful tool for clarification. Laird Wilcox, who along with John George authored the excellent 1996 study of American extremists, lists a number of traits that define extremism and are useful for separating the regressive left from the socially liberal nice guys. These are: 1. Character assassination. Extremists often attack the character of an opponent rather than deal with the facts or issues raised. Some of these matters are not entirely irrelevant, but they should not serve to avoid the real issues. Extremists object strenuously when this is done to them, of course. 2. Name-calling and labeling. Extremists are quick to resort to epithets, to label and condemn opponents in order to divert attention from their arguments and to discourage others from hearing them out. These epithets don't have to be proved to be effective. The mere fact that they have been said is often enough. 3. Irresponsible sweeping generalizations. Extremists tend to make very sweeping claims or judgments on little or no evidence, and they have a tendency to confuse similarity with sameness. The sloppy use of analogy is a treacherous form of logic and has a high potential for false conclusions. 4. Inadequate proof of assertions. Extremists tend to be very fuzzy about what constitutes proof, and they also tend to get caught up in logical fallacies. They tend to project wished-for conclusions and to exaggerate the significance of information that confirms their beliefs, while derogating or ignoring information that contradicts them. They tend to be motivated by feelings more than facts, by what they want to exist rather than what actually does exist. Extremists do a lot of wishful and fearful thinking. 5. Advocacy of double standards. Extremists generally tend to judge themselves or their interest group in terms of their intentions, which they tend to view very generously, and others by their actions, which they tend to view very critically. They would like you to accept their assertions on faith, but they demand proof of yours. They tend to engage in special pleading on behalf of themselves or their interests, usually because of some alleged special status, past circumstances, or present disadvantage. 6. A tendency to view their opponents and critics as essentially evil. To the extremist, opponents hold opposing positions because they are bad people, immoral, dishonest, unscrupulous, mean-spirited, hateful, cruel, or whatever, not merely because they simply disagree, see the matter differently, have competing interests, or are perhaps even mistaken. 7. Manichaean Worldview. Extremists have a tendency to see the world in terms of absolute good and evil, for them or against them, with no middle ground or intermediate positions. All issues are ultimately moral issues of right and wrong, with the right position coinciding with their interests. Their slogan is often, "Those who are not with me are against me." 8. Advocacy of some degree of censorship or repression of their opponents and critics. This may include a very active campaign to keep opponents from media access and a public hearing, as in the case of blacklisting, banning, or quarantining dissident spokespersons. They may actually lobby for legislation against speaking, writing, teaching, or instructing subversive or forbidden information or opinions. They may even attempt to keep offending books out of stores or off library shelves, discourage advertising with threats of reprisals, and keep spokespersons for offensive views off the airwaves or certain columnists out of newspapers. In each case, the goal is some kind of information control. Extremists would prefer that you listen only to them. They feel threatened when someone talks back or challenges their views. 9. Tend to identify themselves in terms of who their enemies are, whom they hate, and who hates them. Accordingly, extremists may become emotionally bound to their opponents, who are often competing extremists themselves. Because they tend to view their enemies as evil and powerful, they tend perhaps subconsciously to emulate them, adopting the same tactics to a certain degree. For example, anti-communist and anti-Nazi groups often behave surprisingly like their opponents. To behave the opposite of someone is actually to surrender your will to them, and opposites are often more like mirror images that, although they have left and right reversed, look and behave surprisingly alike. 10. Tendency towards argument by intimidation. Extremists tend to frame their arguments in such a way as to intimidate others into accepting their premises and conclusions. To disagree with them is to ally oneself with the devil, or to give aid and comfort to the enemy. They use a lot of moralizing and pontificating and tend to be very judgmental. This shrill, harsh, rhetorical style allows them to keep their opponents and critics on the defensive, cuts off troublesome lines of argument, and allows them to define the parameters of the debate. 11. Use of slogans, buzzwords, and thought-stopping cliches. For many extremists, shortcuts in thinking and in reasoning matters out seem to be necessary in order to avoid or evade awareness of troublesome facts and compelling counter-arguments. Extremists generally behave in ways that reinforce their prejudices and alter their own consciousness in a manner that bolsters their false confidence and sense of self-righteousness. 12. Assumption of moral or other superiority over others. The most obvious would be claims of general racial or ethnic superiority, a master race, for example. Less obvious are claims of ennoblement because of alleged victimhood, a special relationship with God, membership in a special elite or class, and a kind of aloof, high-minded snobbishness that accrues because of the weightiness of their preoccupations, their altruism, and their willingness to sacrifice themselves and others to their cause. After all, who can bear to deal with common people when one is trying to save the world? Extremists can show great indignation when one is insensitive enough to dare challenge these claims. 13. Doomsday thinking. Extremists often predict dire or catastrophic consequences from a situation or from failure to follow a specific course, and they tend to exhibit a kind of crisis-mindedness. Whatever it is, it's just around the corner unless we follow their program and listen to the special insight and wisdom to which only the truly enlightened have access. For extremists, any setback or defeat is the beginning of the end. 14. Belief that it's okay to do bad things in the service of a good cause. Extremists may deliberately lie, distort, misquote, slander, defame, or libel their opponents and or critics, engage in censorship or repression, or undertake violence in special cases. This is done with little or no remorse, as long as it's in the service of defeating the communists or fascists or whomever. Defeating an enemy becomes an all-encompassing goal to which all other values are subordinate. With extremists, the end justifies the means. 15. Emphasis on emotional responses and less importance attached to reasoning and logical analysis. Extremists have an unspoken reverence for propaganda, which they may call education or consciousness raising. Symbolism plays an exaggerated role in their thinking, and they tend to think imprecisely and metaphorically. Harold D. Loswell, in his book Psychopathology in Politics, says, "The essential mark of the agitator is the high value he places on the emotional response of the public." Effective extremists tend to be effective propagandists. Propaganda differs from education in that the former teaches one what to think, while the latter teaches one how to think. 16. Hypersensitivity and vigilance. Extremists perceive hostile innuendo in even casual comments, imagine rejection and antagonism concealed in honest disagreement and dissent. See latent subversion, anti-Semitism, perversion, racism, disloyalty, and so on, in innocent gestures and ambiguous behaviors. Although few extremists are clinically paranoid, many of them adopt a paranoid style with its attendant hostility and distrust. 17. Use of supernatural rationale for beliefs and actions. Some extremists, particularly those involved in cults or extreme religious movements, such as fundamentalist Christians, militant Zionist extremists, and members of mystical and metaphysical organizations, claim some kind of supernatural rationale for their beliefs and actions, and that their movement or cause is ordained by God. In this case, stark extremism may become reframed in a religious context, which can have a legitimizing effect for some people. It's surprising how many people are reluctant to challenge religiously motivated extremism because it represents religious belief, or because of the sacred cow status of some religions in our culture. 18. Problems tolerating ambiguity and uncertainty. Indeed, the ideologies and belief systems to which extremists tend to attach themselves often represent grasping for certainty in an uncertain world, or an attempt to achieve absolute security in an environment that is naturally unpredictable or perhaps populated by people with interests opposed to their own. Extremists exhibit a kind of risk-averseness that compels them to engage in controlling and manipulative behavior, both on a personal level and in a political context. to protect themselves from the unforeseen and the unknown. The more laws or rules there are that regulate the behavior of others, particularly their enemies, the more secure extremists feel. 19. Inclination towards groupthink. Extremists, their organizations, and their subcultures are prone to a kind of inward-looking group cohesiveness that leads to what Irving Janis discussed in his excellent book, Victims of Groupthink. Groupthink involves a tendency to conform to group norms and to preserve solidarity and concurrence at the expense of distorting members' observations of facts, conflicting evidence, and disquieting observations that would call into question the shared assumptions and beliefs of the group. 20. Tendency to personalize hostility. Extremists often wish for the personal bad fortune of their enemies and celebrate it when it occurs. When a critic or an adversary dies or has a serious illness, a bad accident, personal legal problems, or anything of the sort, extremists often rejoice and chortle about how they deserved it. I recall seeing right-wing extremists celebrate the assassination of Martin Luther King, and leftists agonizing because George Wallace survived an assassination attempt. In each instance, their hatred was not only directed against ideas, but also against individual human beings. 21. Feel the system is no good unless they win. For example, if they lose an election, then it was rigged. If public opinion turns against them, it was because of brainwashing. If their followers become disillusioned, it's because of sabotage. The test of the rightness or wrongness of the system is how it impacts upon them. The regressive left converts socially liberal ideologies into closed belief systems that refer to themselves in order to justify themselves, and use denial of guilt of heresy as proof of heresy, in which denial of being a racist, homophobe, or whatever is cited as direct evidence of one's guilt. This Kafka trapping is very reminiscent of the workings of the medieval inquisitions and witch hunts, and was characteristic of the pro-communist show trials in Stalin's USSR and the anti-communist zeal of McCarthyism. It is a sad reflection on the failure of our academic and media institutions that history has not been learned from, and both the ideologies and techniques of the regressive left have been embraced by media and academia largely without question in much of the Western world, when employed in the defense of the charmed circle of feminists, Islamists, and anti-racists. Richard Hofstadter's excellent 1963 essay on the paranoid style in American politics could apply just as well to the postmodernist critical theory of the regressive left. To paraphrase the manner in which Hofstadter contrasts the paranoid style with sober and accurate reflections on history, quote, "The central image is that of a vast and sinister conspiracy, a gigantic yet subtle machinery of influence set in motion to undermine and destroy a way of life. One may object that there are conspiratorial acts in history, and there is nothing paranoid about taking note of them. This is true. All political behavior requires strategy. Many strategic acts depend for their effect upon a period of secrecy, and anything that is secret may be described, often with but little exaggeration, as conspiratorial. The distinguishing thing about the paranoid style is not that its exponents see conspiracies or plots here and there in history, but that they regard a vast or gigantic conspiracy as the motive force in historical events. History is a conspiracy set in motion by demonic forces of almost transcendent power, and what is felt to be needed to defeat them is not the usual methods of political give and take, but an all-out crusade. This describes precisely the manner in which the regressive left perceives whichever forms of marginalization they are most concerned with. Racism and patriarchy were not unfortunate historical detours necessitating a sober and liberal feminism and anti-racism to correct. Rather, racism and patriarchy are the sole defining characteristics of Western civilization, embedded in our every institution, form of relationship, our language, and even our subconscious thoughts. This is why, from the regressive leftist mindset, the ends of defeating oppression justify any means necessarily employed to do so. The moral compass of the regressive left is calibrated not to the respect of human dignity and rights that one would expect of a liberal, but to this Leninist notion that truth and morality are measured by whether actions benefit an oppressed or a privileged demographic. Arguments reminiscent of Stalinist denials of repression inside the Soviet Union declare oppressed people incapable of racism and sexism, and so are given a free pass to engage in even the most wanton acts of prejudice. The regressive left has no qualms about usurping the identities and struggles of marginalized peoples they're professing to represent, and to speak on behalf of entire demographics of people, even when individual members of those demographics disagree with them in large numbers.
Opportunistic vanguardism, the idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation.
That the doctrines of the regressive left are rooted in academic critical theory and postmodern philosophy, the overwhelming majority of which were reasonably well-off white male academics, is something they'd rather people not be cognizant of. The truth is that the regressive left, from its powerful pulpits in academia and mass media, demand a monopoly on the right to frame the worldview and perceptions of the marginalized people they profess to represent. The dangerous notion of false consciousness is trotted out to dismiss those members of marginalized groups who deny their marginalization, adding yet another circular thinking dynamic to the style and tactics of the regressive left. This seems to me a grave danger to the liberty of the people with marginalized identities. Observe the historical precedent of the USSR oppressing its working classes under similar types of rationalizations. Censorship of those who offend marginalized peoples is therefore justified because the offense taken by the marginalized is indicative of the overarching, transcendent, meta-historical evil that is patriarchy or white supremacy, and the temporary evil of censorship of a privileged person is a mere inconvenience in the face of it. In truth, the making of these kinds of sacrifices to defeat ultimate evil is something that the regressive left relishes rather than laments, for it signals their intentions to give until it hurts, and go the extra mile in the winner-take-all battle of pure good versus ultimate evil. We've seen enough examples of this kind of thinking in history now to be rightfully concerned. The postmodern regressive leftists have nowhere near the blood on their hands that the fascists and communists do. But this kind of thinking is leading them away from their own best ideals. They've all but lost sight of their initial objectives, racial and gender equality, and now are unabashedly partisan in favor of women or people of color, so long as they conform ideologically, of course, and unabashedly authoritarian and without principle in their methods of activism, undermining their essential credibility among all save for the shamelessly self-serving among their chosen demographics. The price will be paid down the road by the very women and minorities they're professing to champion, for the good name of feminism and anti-racism is being irredeemably spoiled by regressive leftist antics. The weakness of the Western world, however, lies in its failure to recognize the stormtroopers when they wear plaid rather than black shirts and dyed hair instead of steel helms. Of course, the regressive left is a long way still from the kind of power needed to shed blood on Bolshevik or fascist levels. But the failure of media and academia to recognize the distinctively illiberal ideas when advanced under the banner of historically liberal ideas should be of concern to us all, but especially those most concerned for the freedom and liberty of the historically disadvantaged. These have been Samizdat Broadcasts. Over and out.